Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is day 228, Saturday, October 21st, 2017. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, back to the Dossier. The Dossier has moved back to the front burner, my friends. We have new news. Now, for those of you who are new to my video, I just want to let you know that it was this, not just the Dossier itself, but it's a very big part of the major thing that's driving the TowerGate videos. And the thing that actually got me started doing these TowerGate videos was the day that Trump came out and said that he was being wiretapped by the Obama administration. Now, when he said that, I thought about it for about 2 days. And it reminded me so much of the Watergate thing. And of course, being a student of political history and being someone who studied the Watergate affair very, very closely, it just, I thought, if this is true, what he's saying, this is bigger than anything that could have happened during Watergate. Much, much bigger. So I decided to start following this story. And I thought, well, I think I'll do like a diary and just keep it day by day, play by play of the events as they go along. Because if this turns out to be true, this is a major, major story. And I decided, well, instead of doing like a notebook and writing things down, how about I just do a video every day? So this really started out, TowerGate started out as to follow the story that Trump had claimed he was being wiretapped. But once we got farther into this story, we learned that the wiretapping or surveillance of Trump was just a small part of a much larger operation, which was a deep state coup, an attempt to sabotage the presidency or the candidacy at that point of then candidate Trump, and then once he became president, to sabotage the presidency of Donald Trump, which continues to this day. So now the wiretapping, the surveillance, or what have you, as well as the dossier, are just two pieces of the overall puzzle. But the dossier became a very, very important piece of the puzzle as we moved farther and farther down the road. And so I've been covering the dossier very, very closely. Now, I actually did, I think, the best expose that you'll find on the dossier. I looked at other YouTube videos, did a lot of research online, and you get bits and pieces a lot of places. But what I decided to do was I did two videos. I did TowerGate, the Dossier Part 1, and TowerGate, the Dossier Part 2. Two-part video, each one around 30 minutes in length. And I give you the entire history of the dossier from beginning to end, from its birth until the time it was released by BuzzFeed. I give you all the characters, all the players, the sources, everything that the documents suggest, the whole 9 yards. It's all there. I think it's the very best expose you'll find on the dossier. I did those videos, I believe, back in June, either late June or early July. So if you want to see those videos, and if you're interested in the dossier and want to know everything about it, and it's very important, I would recommend you go to my YouTube channel, scroll back through my videos, back into about the middle of the summer, and there you'll see the dossier Part 1 and 2. If you're interested in this, I recommend that you watch both those videos. To this date, everything I said in those videos, I cite all my sources, and I've not had to go back and change anything. It comes from official reporting, and I do give my sources on that. And I have not had to go back and change or modify anything. Obviously, we have learned some new things since I did those videos, and I have covered them in videos I've done recently since I did the first two. So, having said that, let's go ahead and talk about now the dossier and why it's moved back to the front burner and why it is so crucial to this overall deep state coup that we're now witnessing. So the dossier is critical to the main theme of my TowerGate videos. And it did start out with the surveillance and worked its way through to where we are now, to where it became a much larger piece of many pieces of this big puzzle that we're trying to understand. Now, one of the main reasons, and there's many reasons, but one of the main reasons why the dossier is so important is because the dossier we now know, which we learned at the end of September, was used as the reason for the FISA warrant that was used to conduct surveillance on Carter Page. The dossier was the reason that they used to get the surveillance, the FISA warrant on Carter Page. Now let's just do a quick recap of the dossier. Sort of a short version of the recap. What happened with the dossier was back during the primaries, a Republican donor known to be associated with the Jeb Bush campaign went to Fusion GPS, an opposition research firm in Washington, D.C., and said, hey, we'd like you guys to do some opposition research, dig up some dirt on Trump. So they began doing their opposition research for a Republican donor. But once Trump won the nomination, that Republican donor no longer had a need to do this opposition research because the primary was over and Trump won. Bush lost. It was over. But at that point, Glenn Simpson, of one of the three founders of GPS Fusion and who was running really this particular operation, decided, hey, you know, we've got this information. We've been pulling in over $100,000 a month on this baby. We'd like to keep it going. So he decided what he would do is he would go find a Democratic donor similar to the Republican donor he had who would be interested in continuing to fund the opposition research on Trump, because now it was going to be Trump versus the Democrat, which would, of course, be the rotten Reverend Clinton. So now it was Trump versus Clinton. And so he went out looking for the donor. And, you know, at this point, we can feel pretty comfortable that he found a Democratic donor. That's what we're being told, is that it was a Democratic donor who picked up the tab and picked up funding GPS Fusion to do the dossier, to do this thing after the Republican dropped out. So now we got a Democratic donor allegedly being the ones who are now funding the opposition research by GPS Fusion moving forward. Now, once the Democratic donor came into play, Glenn Simpson, who is a retired or former journalist, liberal journalist from the Wall Street Journal, who joined together with two other former Wall Street Journal reporters and formed the GPS Fusion Company, MDC, he reached out to his old friend who used to be a source of his when he was a reporter. That source was Christopher Steele. Christopher Steele, of course, resided in London. He, along with his partner, owned a similar type of opposition research company in London. Now, Christopher Steele was at one time the bureau chief for the British intelligence in Moscow. So during that time, he made a lot of contacts in Moscow, which is one reason why the fact that he was the former bureau chief for the UK and Russia, and because he had a long relationship with Glenn Simpson, that's why Glenn Simpson turned to Christopher Steele to see if he would be able to dig up some information for him regarding Trump and his dealings with Russia and that sort of thing. So that's how Christopher Steele got brought into this whole thing. Now, what happens next, of course, we'll kind of go to the end and then go back a little bit. What happens, you know, at some point, once we get to the end of all this and the document is created, the 35-page dossier is finished, at that point, somehow the publication BuzzFeed gets their hands on it and they publish it. Now, in doing so, they basically outed three people. Number one, Carter Page. Number two, Alpha Bank. And number three, a European businessman named Gubarev. Now, Mr. Gubarev felt that because his name was mentioned in the dossier, that he was being slandered. The dossier suggests that that Putin put the Russian FSB, which is like the Russian version of the CIA, put them onto Mr. Gubarev and told them either by bribing him or extorting him or by putting pressure on him that they wanted Mr. Gubarev to have his tech company that he owned do the actual hacking into the DNC. The idea was that Mr. Gubarev would use his tech firm to hack the DNC, get this information, and then give it to WikiLeaks so they could publish it, which would do harm to the Hillary Clinton campaign in favor of Trump. Now, Mr. Gubarev vehemently denies this whole thing, says he had nothing to do with it. His company did not hack the DNC or anything else, and therefore, because his name was mentioned in the BuzzFeed dossier article, that he had been slandered. So he filed a civil lawsuit against Christopher Steele in London and against BuzzFeed in Florida. Now, as we followed this story as it moved along, we saw several things. In the lawsuit in London against Christopher Steele, we began to see where Christopher Steele began to distance himself from the dossier. One major thing he said that we learned in the deposition hearings in London was that he said that he did not go out and look for this information, that it came to him. Very important piece of information. He had these sources, but apparently he's stating now in his deposition a couple of months ago that he did not go out proactively seeking out these individuals, that they came to him. And we can assume that he's talking about these 5 sources he gives in the dossier is source A, B, C, D, and E. Or actually it's A, B, C, and F, and he skips E for some reason. So anyway, he's saying he didn't go out and look for these people, they came to him. That's a very important point to keep in mind for later on in this video. The next thing that we learned from Christopher Steele's attorneys in that deposition hearing is that he states that not only did he, Christopher Steele, not give the dossier to BuzzFeed, but he stated that there was only a small handful of people who even had access to this dossier. 2 of them, he says, would have been him and his partner there at Orbis in London. They had a copy of the dossier, the full 35-page dossier. GPS Fusion had a full copy of the 35-page dossier because, of course, it was Fusion that hired Christopher Steele to put the thing together. Then, of course, the next player, Senator John McCain, Senator Magoo, had a full copy of the 35-page dossier. Because what happened is McCain was at a meeting in Canada. He first learned of it, heard of it, so he sent his right-hand man, David Creamer, over to London to meet with Christopher Steele. According to Christopher Steele's attorneys, Christopher Steele met with Mr. Creamer. He allowed Mr. Creamer to take some photographs of some documents, and Steele says he filled in Mr. Creamer on some details of the dossier, but he did not give it to him at that point. At this point, Creamer goes back to the States and shows John McCain the documents he photographed and gives him the story that was given to him by Christopher Steele. Shortly after that, Christopher Steele polishes up the dossier, finishes it, and he sends it to Fusion GPS, to Glenn Simpson, along with a note letting Glenn Simpson know that he should produce a hard copy and give it to John McCain, likely through David Creamer, so that John McCain would have a copy. Then, of course, we learn that John McCain then goes to James Comey on December the 5th and presents him with his copy, the hard copy, of the 35-page dossier. Now, Comey had been getting bits and pieces, as we're told at this point, allegedly, was getting bits and pieces of the dossier from his FBI sources in Rome, who were communicating with various Russian individuals and apparently being told about this dossier. So what's important here is that Christopher Steele, of course, keep in mind, Mr. Gubarev, as well as Alpha Bank, who's also now filed a civil lawsuit, and Carter Page, who's also filed a civil lawsuit, all these 3 players were in the dossier as having a role in this overall program, which was allegedly, the dossier basically is telling us that Trump and members of his team colluded with the Russian government to sabotage the campaign of Hillary Clinton, to defeat her, and to help Trump get elected. Along with this salacious story about Trump and the yellow showers or golden showers or whatever. So this is what the dossier is all about. All have denied the dossier is true. Now, Mr. Gubarev sued because, according to him, he's lost a lot of money in his business because his name was brought up in the dossier released by BuzzFeed, and that's why he is suing BuzzFeed and Christopher Steele. Now, there's no question that Mr. Gubarev is going to collect a lot of money. No question about it. He was slandered, as was Carter Page and Alpha Bank. They're all named in the dossier that was published by BuzzFeed, and they all deny it. They all feel they were slandered. So there's no question that BuzzFeed is going to be paying Mr. Gubarev. No question about that. Likely they'll be paying Mr. Carter as well, or Carter Page. They'll likely be paying Alpha Bank as well. All were slandered by the dossier, which was published by BuzzFeed. And that's why these civil suits are ongoing. Question is not whether or not they're going to pay. Question is who all is going to pay and how much. Now, to get to the question, those questions answered, that's why they're doing this, these civil hearings and this investigation. Now, of course, we have the Congress. They're doing investigations for other reasons. Not because they were slandered, but because they want to find out exactly who was behind it. And that's one of the big questions. Who was the Democratic donor that was funding this opposition research through Fusion GPS? And what were the motivations? That will have a lot to do with how much. What was motivating them is also important to Gubarev's lawyers, because that will help them in getting more damages. So all these things are playing out. Now, in the lawsuit against BuzzFeed happening in Florida, in their deposition, Glenn Simpson, representing Fusion GPS, his attorneys, of course, representing him, came out and stated in their deposition that they also deny giving the dossier to BuzzFeed. They do state that BuzzFeed came to them and asked them to give him a copy of the dossier, but according to BuzzFeed's attorneys in the deposition, BuzzFeed's Fusion GPS says that they refused BuzzFeed's request to get a copy of the dossier. Now that only leaves one man, one person, or maybe two, who could have gotten this dossier or would have passed it on to BuzzFeed, and that would be Senator Magoo, or his right-hand man, David Kramer. You see, this is what's being alleged by Christopher Steele as he continues to try to distance himself from it. And of course, BuzzFeed is distancing themselves from it as well. Now, they really can't. They published the dossier, so they're definitely going to pay, but they do not want to give up their source. Now, John McCain, for his part, has basically denied that he was the person who gave it to BuzzFeed, and his right-hand man, who was sent over to get the dossier or to get info on it, has refused to even comment on whether or not he was the source. But someone gave that dossier to BuzzFeed, and they're going to pay right along with BuzzFeed. So it's not a question of whether or not BuzzFeed is going to pay the man. The question is, who else is going to be paying? And Mr. Gubarev's attorneys want to find out whether that's McCain, Christopher Steele, or GPS Fusion, or someone else. Someone else is going to be dropping some large amounts of cash on Mr. Gubarev, and likely Carter Page and Alpha Bank as well. Now, the GPS Fusion is basically using, in their defense, and not wanting to give up the name of the donor, the Democratic donor, because that's a big question everyone wants to know, is who was this Democratic donor. Now, GPS Fusion is using, in their defense, by their attorneys, they're trying to use a attorney-client privilege, or almost like a doctor has a private, deal with his patient. They're trying to use this sort of attorney-client privilege thing. But the government's arguing on the other side that, wait a minute, Fusion GPS is not attorneys. They're an opposition research firm, and they're journalists. They're not attorneys. They don't enjoy attorney-client privileges, so they should have to give up the name of that source. Of course, we know when Glenn Simpson was interviewed in his closed session, he would not even appear at the hearings if he were asked that question. So they were not allowed to ask that question. He did not have to give up the name. Christopher Steele certainly says that he doesn't know. John McCain says he didn't give the thing to BuzzFeed, and doesn't know who did either. And of course, Kramer isn't talking. Now, I suggested, for those of you who watch my videos, that all they have to really do to find out who was the person, this donor, who was paying for this opposition research, if they want to find out who that is, all they need to do is look at the financial records, the tax records, particularly the earned income tax statement on the tax filings of Fusion GPS during the time period that this dossier was being created, during the end of the campaign, the primary campaign, and going through probably to the very to the inauguration, and maybe beyond. Because there, Fusion GPS, you will find they have to show where their money came from. They have to show who paid them and how much. And if you just look at the amounts of money, we know is approximately between 100 and 150 grand a month, and you know back the time period that the money would have come in, it will not be very hard for investigators to figure out who that Democratic source was. So, we learned in the past several days that on the very day this past week that when Devin Nunes subpoenaed the other two co-founders of Fusion GPS to come and testify behind closed doors to Congress, that very same day they also filed a subpoena with the bank, Fusion GPS's bank, to turn over all the financial records over the past 24 months, the past 2 years of all of Fusion GPS's banking transactions. Now, as soon as the bank got this court order, they contacted their customer, Fusion GPS, and said, hey, we just got a court order saying that we have to turn over all your financial transactions for the past 2 years. This, of course, prompted Fusion GPS to get their attorneys to go to court and try to block this. And where it stands right now is that the judge has now gone back to Devin Nunes and the House Intelligence Committee and said, okay, they're blocking it. So now you got to come and show us why getting these financial records is important to your investigation. And that's where it stands right now. So obviously there are different motivations for Mr. Gubarev and his attorneys. They're looking for money. Okay, and Mr. Gubarev wants to clear his name. Obviously, the House Intelligence Committee, headed by Devin Nunes, and the Senate Judiciary Committee, headed by Charles Grassley, they're looking for information as to who was the funding and who was the source of the funding to GPS Fusion for the dossier for different reasons. Because they're investigating this whole Russia connection thing, as well as the surveillance and all these other things. So that leads us to probably the most important question here, which is that we saw in the hearings when Comey was being asked about the dossier. He really didn't want to talk about it very much. If you remember, he kept saying, well, that's something that should be talked about behind closed doors, because Comey was an open session, public hearings. And he would not really comment hardly at all on the dossier. The only thing he would comment on is that he would say that they had decided, because he was asked if they paid, because it was a rumor that they were going to pay Christopher Steele 50 grand to verify it. Comey basically said that he wouldn't go into great detail on that, but the short answer to the question was that no, they did not pay Christopher Steele 50 grand to verify the document. Okay, so that's where that stood. But you can tell that throughout the hearings, Comey didn't want to talk about the dossier and suggested it should be done behind closed doors if they're going to talk about it. John Brennan, when he was questioned about it, distanced himself and the CIA away from it as well. He acted like, oh, the dossier, well, I didn't pay much attention to it. It wasn't a big thing. Wasn't even hardly on our radar. Yeah, we knew about it, but yeah, it's not something, So basically, John Brennan didn't want to talk about the dossier at all and wanted to distance himself and the CIA as far away from it as they possibly could. Of course, we know he's lying, and he's up to his eyeballs in the dossier, and I believe that if we ever get to the truth, we'll learn that. Remember, John Brennan was Hillary's bitch boy. It was John Brennan who was running the CIA, close friend and confidant and supporter of Hillary Clinton. He was hoping that once she was elected, he would be reappointed CIA director for her entire tenure. That did not happen. And as we've seen, the Department of Justice, the FBI, both former and current, as well as many Democrats on these committees that are looking into this, have done everything they possibly could do to keep this information from coming out. They're doing everything they can. GPS Fusion, Christopher Steele, and BuzzFeed are all getting complete protection from the deep state, all these agencies and organizations, to make sure that they do not have to give up the name of that donor. Which leads us to the most important question of this video. Why is that? Why is the FBI, both former and current, the Justice Department, former and current, members of Congress on these committees that are Democrats, and just about everyone else, the media and everyone else you can think of who's involved, why do none of them want us to learn the name of the Democratic donor that was paying GPS Fusion for this opposition research? Why? There's nothing illegal about it. This Democratic donor is doing what a lot of Democratic donors and candidates and PACs and things do. They run negative commercials. They do opposition research. They pay professional companies like Fusion GPS to do these sorts of things. There's nothing illegal about it. It's typical politics. Everybody does opposition research on their opponent. There's nothing that this Democratic donor would be in any legal liability for. All they did was pay GPS Fusion to get the dirt. They didn't publish anything. They didn't do anything, as far as we know. They just paid for it. There's no legal liability. So why is everyone trying so hard at so many different levels to protect this Democratic donor? Well, it appears to me and a lot of other people that maybe this Democratic donor was not just some deep-pocketed supporter of the rotten Reverend Clinton. Maybe there's much more to it than that. What if, possibly, the FBI or the CIA, members of the deep state, the Obama administration, what if they are the Democratic donor? Nobody wants us to learn the name of the Democratic donor. Why? It's no big deal. Unless it's the FBI or the CIA or someone at the Obama administration, the Justice Department, whoever. What if those agents in Rome working for the FBI were not gathering information from these Russian informants, but rather feeding information to those Russian informants? And that's why they were voluntarily going to Mr. Steele. It would explain why Mr. Steele saying he didn't go out looking, it found him. What if we learn that the FBI or the CIA actually created this whole plot? That they created the false information for the dossier? That they fed it to these Russian sources, who then fed it to Christopher Steele? And he didn't even know it. He didn't even know it. He was just a pawn being played in this. And keep in mind, Christopher Steele also stated, his attorneys in the deposition, that he did share this information about the dossier with British intelligence, the GCHQ, the British version of the NSA, who works very closely with the FBI and the CIA and the NSA. So what if the reason for this entire hardcore cock-blocking that we're seeing by the Justice Department, by the FBI, by the media, by the current and former administrations, to block us finding out who the Democratic donor, what if all that is because it's not just some wealthy Democrat? What if it turns out there was actually the CIA or the FBI all along that set this entire thing in motion, that created the entire fictional document known as the Dossier, that went and fed this information to sources in Rome, Russians, the Russian sources that Christopher Steele used? What if we learn that the Dossier was totally a creation of FBI intelligence, maybe working with or possibly the CIA? What if we learn that? Much, much, much bigger than Watergate. This would bring down the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Justice, not just previous administration, but even the current administration, because they're all blocking it just as hard. Why does no one want us to know who that Democratic donor was? What's becoming more and more evident as we move farther and farther into this, as we watch the civil lawsuit playing out, and we watch Mr. Gubarev's attorneys pushing and pushing in both those lawsuits in Florida against BuzzFeed and against Christopher Steele in London. And as we see the FBI and the Justice Department blocking the two individuals who would know about this, that would be Comey's chief of staff and Comey's attorney, his legal counsel when he was head of the FBI. These guys are not even being allowed to testify. They're under essentially a gag order. They're not allowed to talk about it. Grassley and Nunes are being blocked at every turn. at trying to get the answer to this question. No one wants us to know who that Democratic donor was. Despite the fact that there's no criminal liability, it's just a point of curiosity. Nothing was done wrong. It's not wrong to pay an opposition research firm to do political opposition research. It's perfectly fine. No problem. So what's the big deal? Well, to me and a lot of other people, I think Mr. Grassley, Mr. Nunes, as well as some other people, it's becoming clearly obvious that this Democratic donor is not just some wealthy Democrat. It's someone who they want to protect a great deal. A great deal. And not just private individuals or political individuals, but it's the Justice Department, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, the whole deep state bureaucracy, the Obama administration. They don't want us to know. And that can only signal one thing to me, that it's because this Democratic donor is probably not some wealthy, deep-pocketed Hillary Clinton supporter. It's probably the deep state. Comey, Brennan, Obama administration, the Department of Justice, all behind it. They are the ones likely who created this entire dossier. How much, or whether or not Fusion GPS or Christopher Steele knew who was really behind it and pushing it, whether they were just used as pawns and middlemen, unsuspecting morons in the deal, we don't know. Or whether they do know. We know one thing, Fusion GPS doesn't want to give up that source, and BuzzFeed doesn't. They're willing to be sued for hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to keep that secret quiet. It's very, very important to a lot of people, a lot of powerful people in high places, not to tell us a fact that has no real legal consequence. Who was the Democratic donor? Simple question. Nothing wrong with it. They don't want us to know. It tells us there's something going on here. And I think that this is what Devin Nunes and Charles Grassley suspect. I think it's what a lot of other people suspect. It's why we're getting cock-blocked the way we are. I think at the end of the day, if we get the truth of this, we're going to find out that the dossier was born into life, given life, put into existence by the deep state, probably the FBI, Comey, maybe Rosenstein, maybe Brennan. They're all part of it. This was part of the overall effort to take down then candidate and now President Trump. And now that he's president, they can't. It all backfired on them. Hillary was supposed to win, not Trump. And now they've got this problem on their hands. Who was the Democratic donor? How about James Comey, John Brennan, Barack Obama, Loretta Lynch? Maybe that was your big Democratic donor. And that's why they don't want this story to come out. That's why they don't want the truth to come out. That's why they don't want us to learn who that Democratic donor was. That's why the story is back on the front burner and why I'll keep watching it. So you guys keep your eye on the ball. And I'll be back. You guys have a good night. Thank you for tuning in. Bye.